Okay, today we are on section 2.7, and it's actually a relatively short lesson, mainly about the transitive property. If you remember back in Algebra 1, you learned about the transitive property, and it looks something like this. If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. And basically, you can see we can almost line them all up, like make a chain of events here, right? Since these are both B, if A equals B and B equals C, then we can make that conclusion that A equals C. Well, the transitive property also works in geometry. Notice here, if A is congruent to B, and if A is congruent to C, then we can conclude that B is congruent to C. And we could, if we kind of switch the order on this first one, we could put it all together. In other words, angle B congruent to angle A, and then angle A is congruent to angle C, and we can make that conclusion that angle B is congruent to angle C. So basically, the transitive property works if angles or segments are congruent to the same angle or segment, which we had up above, right? Both A and C were, both B and C were congruent to A, then they're congruent to each other. So you don't need to write all those words out. You can just say transitive property or trans prop. That works. Similarly, if angles or segments are congruent to congruent angles or segments, then they're congruent to each other, and that's still the transitive property. For example, let's say we had angle A congruent to angle B, and then we had angle C congruent to angle D, and then they also told you that angle B was congruent to angle C. Well, we could make a big chain there where angle A congruent to angle B, congruent to angle C, congruent to angle D, and we can make the conclusion then angle A is congruent to angle D. So since B and C were congruent, then angle A was congruent to angle D. So all of that is transitive property. And for the most part, if you can make that chain, so to speak, that chain of reasoning, then you've got the transitive property. We've done problems like above, like what we started with, and we've been calling it substitution, which is perfectly fine as well. We calling it substitution, like back at the top. If I could, since A is congruent to B, I could substitute angle B in here for angle C, and it also could be considered a substitution. So in other words, transitive can be substitution, but substitution isn't necessarily transitive. So in some earlier problems we did this chapter, or this year, I should say, sometimes we solve for a variable, such as x, and then we substitute the value back in for that variable. So if you're substituting in values, then it's a substitution. Only if you can make that like chain of reasoning, then you have transitive. For example, in this example here, we're given A is congruent to B. And so we can set these two angles equal to each other to solve. And when we solve it, we get x equals 14. Now we substitute, right? It's not transitive, but we substitute 14 in for x in the initial definition of A to get A equals 24. So the substitution, like I said, we can use substitution in place of transitive as well. But let's just say in general, substitution and transitive properties can be interchangeable. At times. So let's agree if it's A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C, try to use transitive. Okay, so if we can make that chain of reasoning, let's try to use transitive. If substituting in for a value, you need to use substitution. Now, on today's assignment, you'll see some you can use either or, but some are clearly substitution if if you're switching in. I know there was one example where you had to say you were given like angle 1 congruent to angle 2, and then you're able to say angle 2 was supplementary to angle 3. This would then, if you wanted to say angle 1 was supplementary to angle 3, it would be a substitution. So angle 1, then supplementary to angle 3. That would be substitution, because since angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, we can replace this in here for angle 2. It's not transitive. We don't have this chain of reasoning to use the transitive property. So you'll see on the assignment today, we're going to be using not just the transitive and substitution properties as well, but all the things that we've learned this chapter.